Hi, everyone. It's Matt Henney with Project Q Atlanta. Welcome to another episode of Q Conversations, our Friday live chat about LGBTQ issues. Thanks for bearing with us while we are working out a few last-minute technical difficulties. Today, we're going to look into calls for reforming the Atlanta Police Department coming from the ongoing protests and marches for racial justice and equality. Along for the ride is Mike Fleming, Project Q's Mike Fleming, who is moderating our chat, which you should see over to your right, and dropping any comments there during the event. If you have any questions for our panelists, there's a option at the bottom of the screen called Ask a Question. You can drop your question in there, and we'll get to those shortly. Also, at the bottom of the screen is a poll that you can take. And speaking of our panelists today, I'm joined by three LGBTQ guests who are well-versed in social justice and calls for reforming Atlanta Police. There's Antonio Brown. He is the District 3 representative on the Atlanta City Council. He's been front and center in the recent protests and leading calls for reforming the police department. We also have Dan Grossman, an attorney who specializes in police procedures and conduct. He's responsible for several court orders imposing reforms on the Atlanta Police Department, including some that came out of a federal lawsuit in 2009 after police raided the Atlanta Eagle. And we also have Xochitl Bervera, an attorney and director of the Racial Justice Action Center, and she's worked for years on ending criminalization in Black and Latino communities. Welcome to everyone. Thank you guys for joining us. And
glad to be here.
Thank you. We will just dive right into the questions. So the first one, it's kind of a broad question. Since reforming the Atlanta Police Department is a big topic, means a lot to different people, I wanted to ask each of you, what does it mean to you? And what does change at the agency look like for you? Antonio, if you want to lead us off on that.
Sure. Yeah. So this is something that has been extremely important, in which I've attempted to get in front of around this social justice movement that's been transpiring throughout the entire city of Atlanta. You know, for me, I see it more as a reimagining of public safety. And I think that a lot of, there's been a lot of mixed messaging around defunding the police, reimagining public safety. And I really think the reimagining aspect is really looking at how we can reallocate part of the police budget into restructuring how we see public safety in the city of Atlanta. And there's several ways that I believe, as well as many others believe, can happen that can really get back to the root of why we are experiencing what we're experiencing in this city. And that is, we have to get back to the people. And policing must be a reflection of the people. So when I look at restructuring public safety, or when we're engaging in these conversations around restructuring public safety, there's a need for community policing, where many, this didn't really get a lot of press, but I instituted one of the first community policing units on the west side of Atlanta off of MLK and Lowry, where under the direction of Chief Shields, we established a unit of bikes and foot patrols that were able to canvass the area multiple times a week. And their purpose was to rebuild relationships with the community and reinstall trust. And we were able, within a 90-day period, reduce crime by 57% over in this area that was primarily focused around our Black and brown communities. And it wasn't done in the context of over-policing. It was done with the respect that there was a purpose that was bigger than just some of the surface level issues that were transpiring within our communities. And it really gave officers the ability to get to know the residents. And that's a complaint that I've heard continuously on the ground in these streets as we've been in front of this movement and dealing with protesters and activists and organizers. They don't necessarily need police living in their communities. And I'm not sure police really want to, police a community and that they have to come back to. And a lot of the officers I've spoken to have said that they see this as, a concern, because they want to be able to disconnect at some point in time. So this community policing initiative was really focused around bringing in officers willing to get to know the community. And I don't know if many of you know this, but we're pushing now a budget amendment called the Rayshard Brooks Bill that's going to focus on doing just that, reimagining public safety, and doing it where we've set in motion action items that we can reach, whether it's de-escalation, whether it's expanding PAD, pre-arrest diversion, and the PAT 3 program. These are all measures that, in my opinion, are a reflection of what community has spoken to as what they see as the needs of reimagining public safety.
Xochitl, did you want to dive in on that and sort of talk through what it means for you?
I'd love to, yeah, because there are some places of definite agreement and then some places where it's good for us to have the debate. Because when we talk about police reform, we know that we have been, in my organization, the Racial Justice Action Center, we've been talking about what it means to change our entire public safety system, like to rethink the way that we keep communities and people safe from harm, because that is what a public safety system is supposed to do. And policing in Atlanta has failed us in that. And policing is broader than just the police and includes our court system and our jails. But I would say the system as a whole is in desperate need of reform, really of transformation. But the Atlanta Police Department is an essential aspect of that. And we say, to understand what reforms are needed, you have to ask, what isn't working? Why is policing not actually helping keeping us safe? And in some communities, making us less safe? What is the underlying issue here? And I think, Antonio referred to, for some people, the killing of Mr. Rayshard Brooks may seem like a new problem in the department, and it is not. And I can say that because I have sat with the families of Alexia Christian and DeAndre Phillips, and Oscar Kane, and Jimmy Atchison in council meetings, listening to the families of those lost loved ones, really beg the council to take action. And nor does the problem lie only with when officers use deadly force. The use of force and use of deadly force is one end of a spectrum of a kind of policing that actually increases racial inequity, bloats our jails, and contributes to a breakdown in public safety and wellness in many of our communities and neighborhoods. So the underlying problem in our police department is actually the method of policing and the culture of policing. And this has been created, encouraged, and funded by our city council and our mayor's administration for decades. And that is actually what needs to be reimagined, or what needs to be overhauled, really top to bottom, bottom to top. So to point specifically to some key things, we have too many officers so that many of our neighborhoods look like occupied territories. And not everyone on this call may live in those neighborhoods. It's important for people to travel and see, because some of our neighborhoods people live in the police state. We have too many officers, and we've asked them to do way too many and the wrong things. Why we have our police department address social issues such as homelessness, mental health issues, substance use disorders. We have deployed our police department to do jobs that should be being done by a public health and a community wellness system. And it is also about giving our police military style training, where they are primed to see certain neighborhoods and certain Black and brown people as war zones instead of communities that they are. So there is no amount of de-escalation training nor the right SOPs, though I think all of those things are critical and important for us to look at. And I'm sure Dan will speak to those because we were just talking earlier about it, but we need an overhaul of this department. We need to rethink what public safety is and where we would deploy our resources, where the city would invest if keeping us safe and well, and all of us, is the top priority.
Dan, what about you?
Sure. Well, I think I'm going to say three things. First is, if you're talking about police reform, you need to talk about specifics, really specific details. And I hope that later in this broadcast, we have a chance to talk about some really specific details about how we train the police, what they do at the range, and things like that. One quick example, for a taser, like, we need to talk about things like, what is a taser? Is it a lethal weapon or is it a non-lethal weapon, right? And it needs to be the same for everyone. Like, the idea that a taser is one kind of weapon in the hands of police, but a different kind of weapon in the hands of a civilian doesn't make any sense, right? Either it's a lethal weapon in the hands of everyone, or it's a not lethal weapon in the hands of everyone. But we need to sort of talk about specifics and equipment and things like that and reach a consensus on that, because otherwise we're sending unfair mixed messages to everybody. What I'd like to say about the concept of reform is that we have ducked this issue, right? We have abdicated our responsibility as a society, not just Atlanta, as a society, to have what you might call civilian oversight of police, the way we have civilian oversight of the military. And if
can't hear.
Pardon? I said we have abdicated our responsibility as a society to have civilian oversight of the police, and the reason for that is because our public leaders have been too, I hate to say it, but cowardly, right, to recognize some truths and make some very, very hard decisions. And one truth that we have not wanted to embrace, because we haven't wanted to answer the question, is that there is a balance, like a balance beam balance, between officer safety and civilian safety. And as one goes up, the other goes down. And if you want to make civilians safer, if you want to have fewer Rayshard Brooks type events, right, you need to make policing more dangerous. And if you want to make policing safer, you're going to have more Rayshard Brooks type events. And it is our job as a society to make that choice. We need to make that choice one way or the other. And I'm not here to say which the right choice is, right? Because I'm not the czar of the world. But I am here to say we need to make that choice consciously, intentionally, and then we have to live with the consequences of that choice. And our leaders have not wanted to do that. And so we have allowed police to train themselves, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that before you can talk about reforming a police department, you have to know what your goal is. You have to have a goal, right? We're reforming it to achieve this goal. And this goal can either be increased officer safety, it can be increased civilian safety, but you need to decide what it is. You need to train toward the goal that society decides, right? And then you need to live with the consequences because it's going to be ugly on either side, right? Whichever you choose, you're going to be unhappy about some of the results. I will quickly respond to two things Xochitl said. I definitely agree with Xochitl that this goes beyond specific police reforms. It involves other parts of the criminal justice system. Getting rid, for example, of low-level marijuana laws would have a greater impact on things like mass incarceration and unnecessary or tend to go bad police-civilian interactions than anything else, right? So to have a conversation about police-civilian interactions and not talk about drug laws is you're just missing a huge elephant in the room. Finally, though, I do want to say, Xochitl, you said we have too many officers. I do agree that we are asking officers to do things we shouldn't ask them to do, like provide mental health care. But we do not have too many officers. Atlanta has far too few officers. We're nowhere near our authorized number. And the reason I say that is smaller departments tend to be more violent. Smaller departments tend to resort to force more often. When officers don't feel backed up, when they feel outnumbered, right? And we've seen this in Los Angeles and we've seen this elsewhere. Officers on forces that feel small tend to use lots of force because they feel insecure. Larger police forces tend to be less violent, and you also have a lot of cushion. You've got a lot of wiggle room. It's not easy to fire an officer with early warning signs, which we've done a terrible job of in Atlanta, if your department is already too small, right? A department that is well cushioned with officers, it is much easier to take an officer with early warning signs and either fire him or her or put him or her on some kind of desk duty. So there's a real downside to having a department that's too small.
Okay. So I think we lost Antonio, but we'll work in the background, try to get him back. So, well, Dan, and so you have been involved in lawsuits that have federal lawsuits that have forced change at Atlanta Police. You know, of course, the one that I covered a lot was the lawsuit after the Atlanta Eagle raid in 2009. But you had to repeatedly go back to court to have the court enforce the changes that the city and Atlanta Police agreed to when they settled the lawsuit. Is that some sort of indicator we should see now is how tough it will be to make even policy changes at the police department?
Well, I think it's important to remember that our experience, which has been very difficult, the city has fought against these reforms. They have not wanted to implement them. But the resistance we have not primarily gotten from the Atlanta Police Department. The Atlanta Police Department is not the entity that is pushing back against these reforms. It's the city law department, and it was Kasim Reed, and then, of course, now Keisha Lance Bottoms. The resistance we've gotten has not come from Atlanta's cops, by and large. It's come from Atlanta City Hall. And If that changes, then we'll be able to more effectively have these accountability reforms. And most of the reforms that we are trying to enforce are about accountability. Officers wearing name tags, officers not preventing people from videoing them, a whole bunch of things like that. Filling out certain forms to explain why they're doing something. If they're going to see someone, they need to explain why under certain circumstances. And again, it's not the Atlanta Police Department that's been a problem. It's been Kasim Reed, Keisha Lance Bottoms, and the law department more than any of them, but they report to the mayor. And the city council has just taken a hands-off approach. The city council has never looked into it. They don't care. They don't know what's going on. And they've never said, hey, law department, why are you fighting against things that are good for the city of Atlanta? But it's not the cops. My main beef with this is not with the Atlanta Police Department.
Okay. Let's see. I was just trying to get Antonio back in the conversation. So in June, as these protests were going on, the mayor created the Use of Force Advisory Council. And yesterday, they just came back with a list of 10 initial recommendations. And in response, the mayor issued 3 orders. She committed to improving officer compliance in regards to their body-worn cameras. She committed to creating a way for citizens to submit video footage of use of force by officers. And then she committed to extending the powers of the Atlanta Citizen Review Board, which investigates citizen complaints of police misconduct. Xochitl, what's your reaction to these sort of incremental changes that have, are getting underway this week?
Yeah, I think that it's really important for us to keep our eyes on the prize of what I was saying earlier, in terms of if we understand that what's wrong here is not a bad apple police officer, but actually a method of policing, a way of policing, that is what needs to change. And we look at these reforms, look at each one of them. They are all about what we are going to do after another person is killed. That to me is unconscionable, that we are making reforms that are primarily focused on whether or not we're going to have the proper video footage to hold the officer accountable who kills the next person. I think we should be making reforms that prevent the killings of any of our community members. And I think that we have, the capacity to do that. So I'll even, I'll say I really disagree with what Dan said about our numbers of police force. I disagree even with what, was a cutting edge policing reform idea at one point, this community policing idea. But Atlanta right now has 185% increase, more police per capita than any of our peer cities in terms of population. So cities who have the same population than us have far less officers per capita. And when we talk about what needs to happen in terms of a reinvestment, when we need to think about the millions and millions of dollars that we spend, I think that people don't always know what police are spending their time doing. That we still have this TV notion that police are going and catching the bad guy. We had a city jail that was filled to the brim for many, many years with people who had done nothing more than violate a city ordinance violation or a traffic violation. So we're talking about people who were there for spitting on the sidewalk, for jaywalking, for possession of marijuana, and for driving without a headlight. After many, many years of reform and of focusing attention on that, we have finally driven the population of that jail down, and we are talking about closing it and reallocating those funds. But that's the kind of policing we're looking at in Atlanta, where police are sent out and most of the time are not arresting people on felony charges, are not doing the work of intervening where there might be violence. They are arresting people for jaywalking, spitting on the sidewalk, and possession of marijuana. And when you have that, what you have are targeted communities, poor communities, Black and brown communities, queer and trans communities. The most vulnerable in our communities become targeted by that kind of policing, and then with the kind of violence that we've seen happen. So my response is that we need to be thinking much bigger and much deeper about what we need to do to save lives. The truth is that Rayshard Brooks would be alive today if those officers had called the pre-arrest diversion initiative, the alternative to policing, or if Wendy's had a different number to call to get a response that wasn't a police response. We don't need to pick up the phone and call the police every time there's something happening in our neighborhoods and communities. But as a city, and what we need leadership in the city council, leadership in our mayor's office to do, is to make sure that the resources are put in the places, the public health responses, the community wellness responses, that would actually be able to address those issues well.
But let's be fair about that. Our police officers are largely doing what we told them to do and asked them to do. So if you talk about pre-arrest diversion, we've had a real push. The people at MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and the police department and the public in general has had a real push to arrest and incarcerate drunk drivers, right? That wasn't something that these officers just decided there. Well, he's guilty of DUI, so should we arrest him or should we not arrest him? There's been tremendous pressure on officers. The guidance they have gotten is be hard on drunk driving. So this goes back to we as society need to give direction and need to give goals to our officers. It is not fair to make it a guessing game for cops. And it is not fair to send mixed signals. We have to decide what we want them to do, and then we have to live with the consequences.
Hey, Matt, could I jump in?
Absolutely.
So I've listened, I apologize. I'm on my phone and this thing just has a mind of its own. So I've listened to both of your perspectives, and I believe you are both right in a lot of ways. And, it's interesting as a city council person who has been progressive around reforming policing in the city, as well as has been really spearheading this reimagining on council. What I realize is that there are a lot of issues within the system that creates barriers for police to truly reimagine how they police in communities. But also, I believe as a council, we haven't done our job. We haven't taken accountability for what we could have done. Rayshard Brooks' death is on all of our hands, not just Chief Shields. The mayor is responsible, council members are responsible, because the reality is when I came onto council 1 year ago, I pushed legislation that would make not wearing your body camera a law, where it would be an ordinance where if an officer did not follow the ordinance, that it can lead to immediate termination of their responsibilities. And to me, that was just simple-minded legislation that I thought.
Oh no!
Sorry.
There he is.
That was just simple-minded legislation that I just thought it shouldn't have taken me trying to push it to pass it. And guess what happened? I introduced it and it went nowhere, because as much as we say we're a city too busy to hate, the reality people keep calling me, I apologize. We're a city that is divided, and we're divided by zip codes. We're divided by income inequality. We're divided by concentration of poverty in Black and brown communities. And how we have allowed this system to thrive is that we've kept this divide. And I'll tell you something. PAD, pre-arrest diversion, they have done some incredible work. But guess what? We put the ownership as a city, which I just can't seem to understand or fathom why we do this. But as a city, what Atlanta is really good at, we're really good at bringing in third-party entities and saying, hey, do the job, and we hope you do the job well. And if you don't, we'll cover for you if you don't do the job well. But the reality is we put ownership on the PAD program to police officers that we have not properly trained. So we've told these police officers, hey, you stop someone, they look like, they may be experiencing some kind of hardship, or we think that what is the reason for you pulling them over is contributing to their socioeconomic conditions, or maybe what they're experiencing in their communities. Instead of us saying, hey, officer, pick up and call PAD, they're not doing it. They're not calling PAD. That's why PAD is one of the most underutilized programs in the city of Atlanta. The other thing is, why don't we have an emergency response number for PAD? We should not put the ownership on the officers. We should give the ownership back to the people and say, if you are in a situation in which you need to react and ensure you have people that come and support you, you can dial a number similar to 311 or 911, and a PAD person would come out and meet you and the officer to work to assist the officer in providing you the care and services you need, so that you don't have to come in contact with our criminal justice system. The other piece of this is council needs to step up and do their job. We put a budget amendment together withholding $73 million from the police budget as we reimagine public safety, and it was voted down. And yet we passed a resolution that said we support withholding the money, but when we went to put forth the accounting measure of the actual legislation that does the moving of the money, council voted it down. So are we going to continue talking about the issues, or are we going to move into a place of action, and our action becomes a reflection of what we seek in reimagining public safety in this city? So it's an ownership that we all are responsible for, and we all contribute to, and we all have to take accountability for our lack of action that has gotten us to this place where we've lost a life, a continuous life. Because like I told Mayor Bottoms, Rayshard Brooks is not the first Black person that has died at the hands of police brutality in this city. Oscar Kane, Jimmy Atchison, and the list continues to go on and on and on. We have just chosen to address this right now because it's become a social issue in the means of the public. The public now sees this as a social issue and are now understanding their ability and power to hold elected officials accountable. So now that has become a social justice movement. Now the city wants to act and put forth legislation, and the legislation is still reactive because we already know what needs to happen, yet we continue not to do it because we're sitting giving lip service to the people to make them believe that we're doing something that we're really not.
Well, but this legislation, the proposed legislation, it also evades, it evades the obligation of the civilian management of our city to exercise specific control the way the civilian authorities exercise control over the military. I want to briefly mention, as far as this defunding stuff goes, it's silly for the Atlanta City Council and mayor to say that they want to withhold $73 million in order to have leverage over the police department. You already have total leverage over the police department. They work for you. They work for the mayor and the city council. You can tell them to do whatever you tell them to do. You don't need to play with their budget to give them an order, and you can just tell them what to do. Part of the problem is that no one seems to know what to tell them. We're not willing to make this decision. We're not willing to juggle officer safety against civilian safety because neither side looks good to different people. And the only way to do reform, the reforms that we've been talking about, they're all vague. They're all words. Blah, 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 right? You need to know specifics if you're going to change how police interact with people, let's say like Rayshard Brooks. How many people on city council know what a Tueler drill is? Like, do either any of you know what a Tueler?
Well, let me tell you, I think you're missing the mark.
And let me do this. I apologize.
Yeah.
If I don't plug my laptop in, it's going to die. So I'm going to step aside while you talk, Antonio, just so
Okay.
I can just go on.
No, I was just going to say, I think you're missing the mark because we know what to do. We not only know what to do, but we've done the research. We have the data that supports it. We even know what tooling we can utilize so that folks are not using tasers or guns to de-escalate a situation. That's not what's happening right now. What's happening is you have a divided council. You have a generational shift that has occurred on council where you have progressive leaders and you have conservative leaders. The conservative leaders are listening to an older generation of people that believe that there should be no reimagining of public safety. So the will of the people in which they believe they represent is stifling the will of the progressive leadership on council from being able to move anything forward. Well, and hold on, but let me just say this. Yeah. The withholding of the $73 million has absolutely nothing to do with saying that we don't know we have the power. No, we know we have the power. The $73 million to reimagine public safety and holding that money is to stop talking about it and allow our actions to become a reflection of the work that needs to happen. And it's for the conservative members on council to say, listen, just because you believe that this is not right, the people are speaking and saying that this is what they need. So if that means we have to strategically leverage and withhold funding to ensure that the action is put behind what we continue to speak about in public, then that is what's necessary. But trust and believe, I am very much aware of my powers and abilities to affect change and reimagine public safety. And I've done the research, and I also have identified the tooling along with a million other organizations to do the work. We just need to do the work.
Well, but that work involves specifics, right? That work involves understanding the 21-foot principle. Like, I hope you're familiar with that. How many 21-foot principle videos have either of you seen, Antonio or Xochitl?
So I've seen 0. Okay. And let me just say to you, I've never heard of it before, but again, I think that is the disconnect with your generation and my generation is we don't care about the 21-step principle. What we care about is moving from a place of talking about what needs to happen. How many plans has the city of Atlanta had around principles?
Let me tell
and
you
nothing's happened.
Antonio, the thing you just said you don't care about is why Rayshard Brooks is dead. The thing you've never seen, and the thing you don't know about, and the thing you don't care about, and don't think anyone should care about, is the reason Rayshard Brooks was shot.
I disagree with you.
I would disagree with that. I would disagree also. Or I would say, as if we're having generational. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, go ahead and jump in, Xochitl.
I was going to say, because I think maybe I sit generationally in between. I don't know. I can't guess people's ages. But I just want to say, I mean, I really do. I think where I hear Dan in where I appreciate what you're saying is that I do think it's really important for us to know the details and to understand and to have done the research. But I really agree, Antonio, that this is an issue of political will, and that there is a generational split, just like there is a zip code, a socioeconomic split, a racial split in this city, and we need to be calling it for what it is. And I do think that we have had, I mean, one of the things I have yelled for the last month and a half is that there are organizations and there is expertise in this country, in this city. And it is not, we don't need to go straight to the first answer that pops up when you Google it. We don't need to do that. We don't need to find the one that, sounds best on the soundbite when you stand in front of a podium. We need the details in terms of how we actually rebuild a public safety system. We need to look at the data, and we also need to get that we're visioning something new. We're on the brink of a new world, folks. And if anybody is alive right now watching what's happening, we are on the brink of a new world. And in that new world, there is going to be reimagining, and there's going to be experiments that happen, because we have been doing policing like this and people have traced it back, but since slavery, this is a legacy, a living legacy of social control in this country that goes back hundreds of years. And if we're going to do it differently, if we're going to look first at our communities and ask what keeps us safe and well and build something from there, we're going to have to experiment. We might get some things wrong. We're going to get a lot of things right. We're going to do better than shooting people in the back when they're running. So I think that I just really agree that we need to, if this is an issue of political will, and it is an issue of bringing communities together to understand also for some of us to say, if someone else in my community is not safe from the police, then I'm not going to stand up and defend that. We have to understand that each other's safety is all of our responsibility, and we can no longer shave off the most marginalized in our communities and let them have an experience and not stand up and say something transformative needs to happen.
An injustice against one is an injustice against us all. Okay, and but let me just say this, and Dan, I apologize because people can say what they want about my position on council, but what I don't believe in lip service. And I don't believe in this idea that we have to fall into this box, this construct that has contributed to many of the social injustices that have plagued our Black and brown communities and have kept us in a place of oppression. I don't need 21 principles to tell me that we have a problem with our public safety. I also don't need 21 principles to tell me how we need to fix it when we've had 1 million organizations already go through that process of identifying what those solutions need to be. I need action now.
Respectfully, Antonio, you're dead wrong. You do need to understand the 21-foot principle. You absolutely need to, because if you want officers to shoot fewer people, you have to know why officers are shooting people. And if you don't know why officers are shooting people, how do you get them to shoot fewer if that is the goal that society uses?
If we don't know by now why the officers are shooting people, we're in trouble.
I don't think you do. Let me ask you this, Antonio. Have you ever taken a pistol and gone to a range and shot the APD range protocol, the APD range procedure? Have you ever shot a pistol at a target that does what the APD targets do?
Absolutely have. And guess what? I'm licensed to carry a gun and have gone through that protocol. Guess what? We need to stop. We need to get to the mental health of officers.
Let's talk about it.
Mental health of officers.
Mental
health.
Listen, I've been calling for individual officers to be fired for years by name who had mental health problems. I called for an officer named Matthew Cadeau to be fired for years in public, and he never was until Erica Shields finally fired him after he shot a civilian tourist downtown, which I had predicted he was going to do. So I've been fighting the mental health fight since long before you were on council. But here's the thing about the range training. So you tell me, if you've done the range training, explain to me, what is it about the way range training is done that played a very huge factor in why Officer Rolfe decided to pull his trigger? Because there is something.
Well, so I'm going to be honest, just from my own perspective, when I took that training and I shot my gun and the moving target that they presented before me, it again, and maybe there's a culture shift here, I still don't understand. It gets back to the root of the issue where why didn't Officer Rouse say to Ray Shard, hey, brother, I see you're intoxicated. I see you've been drinking. I know you just came from your daughter's situation or you're in a peaceful situation. Let me call you an Uber so that you can go home so that we don't have to escalate this situation any further. But hold on, let me just say this. Then when he started running, why didn't I say, as an officer that's supposed to be there to protect and serve, say, you know what? It's two of us. It's one of him. He has a taser. In our training, we are taught to be tased in our police training to keep so that we're aware of what a taser feels like if someone uses it on us. So, you know, he's running. He's intoxicated. Let him go down the street. I'll meet him when he sobers up a little bit. We'll have a conversation and we'll move forward and save a life. That is how, you know, and 21 Principles apparently doesn't teach that.
No, the 21-foot principle, sometimes called the 21-foot rule, it's not really a rule, teaches the opposite. And you need to understand that if you want to know why he shot. And let me give you two. They're not the only reasons Officer Rolfe shot, but they're two that you don't understand and that are crucial to understand. One is that the way that a lot of APD range training works is, you know, you see the target recede and then it flips around. And when it flips around to face you, you are supposed to engage. You are supposed to fire. And if you take an officer and you make him or her go through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of those, and as soon as the thing flips around and faces you, no longer running away from you, right? But the minute it flips and faces you, you are trained to fire. You are conditioned to fire because now it is suddenly a threat, okay? The 21-foot principle is that someone who is within 21 feet of an officer can get to that officer and do harm to that officer faster than the officer can respond with his firearm, which means anyone within 21-foot radius is a potential threat. And what happens is when you show officers those 21-foot videos, which you've never seen, but I suggest you start watching them, because if you see again and again and again and again a simulation on a video where someone who is really far away from you, okay, can get a knife in your throat before you can even unholster your weapon, that is going to make you, for lack of a better word, a little trigger happy. A Tuller drill, which you're not also familiar with, is when you reenact this, okay? And they do that at the Atlanta Police Academy. They have someone stand 21 feet away, and the officer has to unholster his weapon before the guy can attack him, and usually they can't. When you drill training like this into an officer like Officer Rolfe, okay, it is not fair to say that Officer Rolfe made a decision to fire at Rayshard Brooks. That decision was conditioned into him by the way we, as a city, by the way the Atlanta Police Department trained him. We train officers to have instincts and to have muscle memory, because in a split second, you don't have time to think. When I used to be a pilot, if I lost an engine on takeoff, I didn't have time to think. My reaction to losing an engine on takeoff had to be instant, immediate, instinctive, and muscle memory. And we have trained Atlanta police officers to have an instinctive muscle memory reaction that if someone who has some kind of a weapon is running away from them and then suddenly turns and faces them and presents a threat, they have fired their weapon hundreds of times in training. Right? And by
That's right.
Out there with Rayshard Brooks, they are doing not what they choose to do or decide to do at that moment. They are doing what we told them to do. And now you want to dump a ton of bricks on the head of one guy because he did exactly what we made him. We conditioned his brain. We, as a city, as a society, we made his brain do that. Right?
I think that's right. I just want to.
And if anyone wants to talk about police reform, it is nonsensical to talk about police reform if you don't understand the details of police training. If you don't think the 21 foot principle matters, if you don't think tool or drill matters, if you don't think the way we
I think that
let me
actually
just jump
what
in
we're
and Sochi,
saying
if you
is,
want to,
yeah,
get in some thoughts, and I want to move on to another question.
Yeah, because I think we can debate. We're actually saying very similar things, which is that like we are all saying that this is not about one police officer who is bad and wrong and needs to get. We are saying it is a systemic problem that comes through the training that, Dan, you have such detailed knowledge about. It also comes through where we put our resources, and as a city, like you're saying, what we say our priorities are with our budget, with our words, and where we have other options for folks. So if there should be a public health response and not a policing response to an incident, that is happening before the police are even called and the training comes into question. But I couldn't agree more that the systemic nature of this, and what I love about Councilmember Brown, thank you for your leadership on this and all of the ways in which you've been speaking to this, is because the city council is responsible for so much of what has been told to the police department to date to do. And there are immediate things, including decriminalizing the code, stopping the dozens of ordinances that give police the instruction to go around and look for things to arrest people for when they're minor offenses that do not need that kind of attention, as well as this kind of training aspect that Dan is speaking to. We need to be looking structurally and systemically, and I think, and preventatively, so that we are not passing these kinds of reforms that are looking to say, what do we do after the next person is shot and killed? No, we need to be making the reforms that are right now going to prevent such a thing in the future.
Let me make clear that I'm not advocating at this point that we should or shouldn't give 21-foot principle videos in training, and we should or shouldn't do range training the way they do. That's not my place to decide. What I am saying is that we as a society, and that means our city council and our mayor, need to make a conscious decision. They either continue this kind of training, okay, with the recognition that it increases officer safety, which it does, right? It keeps officers more safe, but it exposes civilians to a lot more risk. Or we as a society tell the police academy, stop this training, right? Which will make things safer for people like Rayshard Brooks, but will wind up in more officers being injured and wounded, right? And may make it difficult to get people to serve as police officers. My job is not to say which choice to make. What I'm saying is our public officials need to consciously, intentionally, openly, transparently make a choice, because you have to have either officer safety goes up and civilian safety goes down, or officer safety goes down and civilian safety comes up. And our political leaders need to have the guts and the courage to give direction and to make sure that the academy is training the way you want them to train, whichever way that is, right? You set the goal. You're our civilian leadership. You're the civilian who's in charge of the military. You tell them the goal, and then they're like a paramilitary organization. You make them follow your goal, and if they don't, you discipline them or you deal with them. But first, you have to come up with the goal, and politicians have been too gutless to choose either of those things, so they just go like this. They let police decide how to train police. Of course, we know how that's going to turn out. They're going to train police to protect police, right? And why are they doing that? Not because the government told them to, but because the government told them nothing. The government doesn't want to see, hear, or talk. The government doesn't want to make hard choices. And then you put officers in a tough situation where they can't win. That is just, everything that could be wrong about that in all ways is wrong. Our police are not doing what we want them to do because we've never told them. And then we hold them accountable for doing things we did tell them to do.
I'm gonna step in and get to a couple of questions from the audience members. So, and this gets to, I think, something you just mentioned, Dan. Paul Turner asked, is the issue with APD not so much about race as it is about the paramilitary attitude of the department? Rather than serving and protecting, is it more about defeating an enemy? So I don't know if any of the three of you have thoughts about that.
I'll be quiet.
I can throw in. Yes, of course, I have thoughts on that. I think it is absolutely about both, because there are, small white towns up in the Northeast whose police departments are not trained in paramilitary style because there are not parts of those neighborhoods, those communities that are considered war zones. I think when we are looking in urban settings where police departments are, it is about race, because why are military tactics employed for some? And let's be really real. Someone wrote in the chat, there are also, there's implicit bias. So there are officers behaving differently when they are faced, whether they are officers of color or they're Black or brown officers or they are white officers. And there are situations, there are just that race has a huge role to play in socioeconomic status and in how police departments are deployed. So I just think it's a combo, it's a both and. I think that the militarization of our police departments, the way that the training is happening, it is to look at people as an enemy too often, and that is precisely the thing we need to root out. And I agree with most of what Dan said, and then except that I think it's a false dichotomy to say that we have to trade officer safety for person safety. I think, again, in the old paradigm and some studies that may have been done that may have held, but we can rethink this so that is not the choice we are making. We are not trying to lose anybody's life. And that is the bottom line, is that for too often, there are certain lives that have been deemed not really worthy. In fact, like I said before, I have sat time after time in council with family members whose children were killed, begging city council to do something, being treated like dirt, being disbelieved, being ignored, people being on their cell phone because they couldn't bother to give the 5 minutes to the mother of a child who has been killed by a police department. That's been the attitude for decades. So we have to undo that. Police officers have a lot of respect. There's a lot of institutional, and I like I said, we're not trying to lose any lives. And I think the way you do that is you totally rethink our policing strategy, our public safety system, and we use, much more public health oriented systems to address problems. So we remove this option of killing or not killing from many, many, many situations. And then in the situations where it exists, we can much more finely tune our responses, so we don't have to be making that kind of choice. So I agree with Dan that part of what I do believe is the challenge here is lack of courage on our elected leadership. But I think it's the lack of courage to stand out there and say, being tough on crime has been the slogan for so long. It has been what gets people elected for so long that it is now the time for elected officials to say, no, I'm going to stand on the side of right, even if it's more complex, even if what it sounds like is I'm saying we're being soft on crime. I'm not saying that. I'm saying our communities deserve wellness. They deserve safety. All of us deserve that. And no longer are we going to kind of buy into this myth or soundbite reality, which is that our police system works when it absolutely doesn't.
Well, all of which makes me wonder, why aren't we talking about drug laws as part of this conversation? Why aren't we talking about probably the single biggest thing that causes, if you want to call it mass incarceration, that causes possibly avoidable police-civilian interactions? If you got rid of your low-level marijuana laws, you'd make a huge step toward solving some problems. But I saw you, Antonio, waving your arms. Yes, we don't have it's good. I love your enthusiasm. It's great. Yes, we don't have a change in officer safety and civilian safety, but let me give you a concrete example of how we do, right? And it's, how do you train your officers to react to a taser in the hands of a suspect, right? So we currently explicitly train our officers, that a taser in the hand of a suspect is an incredibly potentially dangerous tool. Because if the person is able to successfully tase, gets 2 prongs in, and you can disable the person's muscles for 5 seconds, right? If you as a police officer are tased by someone, that gives that person 5 seconds to take your weapon. So if you're facing a taser as a police officer, you are trained to treat that taser as the next step from having your weapon taken and used against you. Now, if you don't want to train police officers that way, again, that's a decision that you need to make, right? But recognize that does expose police officers to greater risk. But if you are going to train police officers that way, recognize that in a Rayshard Brooks scenario, they're liable to fire because it's what they were trained to do. So you do have to decide, when a suspect has a taser of his own or steals a taser, what do you want the officer to do? Do you want him to stay safer, or do you want him to err on the side of keeping the civilian safer?
So Dan, this is where me and you have a disconnect, right? And I think it is a generational disconnect, right? Because individuals like yourself, while you speak about city council members, your thought process and how you see things is completely aligned with a lot of the folks on council that tend to not be able to see beyond the construct in which they understand. A lot of what you said was brilliant, and your knowledge and expertise around the subject when it comes to community policing is brilliant. But where we fall short in the conversation and where the opportunity exists is that you're absolutely wrong. I don't have to choose, because when I look at reimagining public safety, I can reimagine public safety from the perspective of ensuring that the training is a reflection of not just keeping the officers safe, but also allowing the officers to do their job of protecting and serving the people as well. I don't have to have one or the other. And if that means we need to go back to the drawing board and we need to restructure our training programs so that they can be inclusive of both, then that's a conversation that I'm willing to have and to understand when we look at reimagining public safety. But I don't have to choose. I do not have to have one or the other in this process of reimagining. And a lot of times on council, that's what I've seen. I've seen council members tell me that I have to choose. No, I don't have to choose. What I need to do is ensure that the people and the police officers are at the forefront of the conversation, and that we're being inclusive of both, and that we're creating a fair process for both. And we're making sure that we're getting back to the fact and the purpose of why we have police officers in the city of Atlanta anyway. You know, and I think that is where this conversation begins to take a whole nother tone and begin to really move us into a place of action, because we're no longer limited by this construct that a generation has established of what I have to stay in order for us to be able to thrive and be successful when we look at reimagining public safety in this city.
Listen, policing is not an innate thing. It's not anyone someone is born knowing how to do. It's something people are trained to do. So you have to ask yourself the question, what conditioned response do you want to create? What do you want an officer to do when someone is running away from him and then suddenly turns and faces him? Because that is not something that officer can decide right then and there. That is something that we train and we condition that officer to respond in a certain way over the course of months and years and academy training and the current training, right? So you have to answer the question, when an officer is chasing someone and that person turns and faces the officer, what do you want the cop to do? Because if he fires quickly, instinctively as a conditioned response, right, that increases officer safety and it decreases civilian safety. If he pauses and thinks and says, please, sir, stop, or whatever, or I have a gun, I'm going to shoot if you don't stop, that increases civilian safety, but it decreases officer safety. And I'm not the one who gets to or should make that decision. It's elected officials like you, Antonio, who need to make that decision, but then you have to live with it.
But this is the thing, Dan, and I think this is, again, where we continue to disconnect. The reality is, right, in order for you bring the knowledge of the police training, the conditioning of the police officers, the mental health component of the police officers. I appreciate and respect all of that. I think, though, in order to dismantle an institutional construct that has been established to keep people oppressed in a system, to keep people in a system that is not reflective of who they are and in their communities, you have to completely dismantle it all the way down to its most granular form. And when you do that, and you do it because you understand the working mechanisms of what you're breaking down, what you're dismantling, you can then build it back up to be a reflection of what is truly a representation of what policing should be. That's why it's called reimagining public safety. So when you're breaking it down and building it back up, your training can be a reflection of whatever it needs to be to protect community and protect our police officers. So again, it's not on a basis of having to choose, because you don't have to choose when you are building something that is already being dismantled and built back up. And that's the point that I'm trying to make.
So when you say dismantle, I mean, I actually don't know in a concrete term what you propose. Like, are you proposing that we fire all Atlanta police officers and hire a bunch of new ones from scratch? I actually don't know. I really don't know. I mean, you talk about dismantle. I don't know what that
I really like you. You're hilarious. I really, really like you in this conference.
I want to step in, guys. We ran quite a bit long, and so we didn't get to some of the questions. So I wanted to just step in, and we have to wrap it up here. I wanted to thank everybody for the very spirited discussion, and thank Xochitl Bervera, Antonio Brown, and Dan Grossman for their time and insights today. And thank you for everyone who has attended. I wish we could carry on. There's a lot of issues that we didn't get to, but we'll have to wrap it up. So thank you to everyone. I appreciate your time and taking part today.
Thank you for
having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Antonio.
Absolutely.